Hi folks. Today is 2.1, the beginning of Module 2, which is Nature and Music. So 2.1 is the music of nature. Let's take a look at what we're going to be doing today. We will first go through the assignment that's due coming up. Then we will discuss homework 2 and what you learned on your sound walkabout. Then a little listening and discussion of Chris Mercer's The Audible Phylogeny of Lemurs. Then we're going to learn a little bit about the spectrogram. Then we'll discuss the Krause article that you read, the niche hypothesis. And finally, we'll look at several examples of nature and music. For next time is this Stolet article, interactive page that's down at the bottom of Module 2. So please scroll down there and click it. This is a really great resource to explain how sound works. You're responsible for reading the first 8 parts here. So you see this is part 1. You can click next to go on to the next part. And be sure to scroll all the way down as you do so you can make sure you read the entire part here. It has some audio examples and some visualizations that will help make the material clear. So 1 through 8 for next time. To discuss homework 2, which was the sound walkabout, I hope you enjoyed this and spent some time getting to listen to what was around you. The idea behind the walking was that you could encounter different soundscapes or a change of volume levels of what's happening around you, and that could give you some different perspectives. So some of the questions from the homework: what sound did you hear that was caused by humans? What sounds did you hear that were natural and not caused by humans? And I think that's very easy on the surface. The obvious stuff, cars are brought by humans. But I'm curious if anyone found any examples of something that was sort of in between, or nature engaged with humans. For example, a tree being pulled down would be a natural sound that's sort of affected by humans. And a lot of the goal here was just to be able to focus on sound and listen more intently to these ambient background sounds than we normally would. And it can be hard to just listen. It's different than listening in the background while you're doing other things. For example, right now, as I'm sitting here, if some sound comes by on the road, I will hear it, but I'm not focused on it. So I'm not going to be paying attention to the nuances of that sound. And hopefully you got a chance to do that. I'm curious to find out from you all whether this was difficult or easy. It can be somewhat difficult to just listen. It could be sort of meditative, trying to quiet the mind and not think about our other classes and just focus only on sound. On the other hand, it could be rather intense to focus on the sounds, especially if the sounds themselves are intense. If there's a dog that sounds like it's in trouble, or some fight that you're overhearing far away. But it could also be intense just to listen to focus on the nature of the sounds themselves. For example, an airplane going over can be a very complex sound because there's a lot of harmonics, which we'll talk about later. So you can hear the Doppler effect, which is what happens when sounds pass by and our perception of the pitch changes. Usually it's lower. So I hope that you got to find some nuances in sounds that you hadn't run into before, and I hope you enjoyed this. A couple other questions that I had around this that are not on the homework assignment is: what sounds were intentional versus incidental? So, for example, an intentional sound is a sound that's produced to be heard on purpose, like a bird call, or when a dog is barking, it's making a sound for the purpose of making a sound. People talking, obviously music playing, car horns, car alarms. Whereas the incidental would be sounds that are created as a byproduct. For example, a chainsaw, very, very loud, but it's not loud for a reason. Car engines, airplanes, footsteps, road noise. And so some are natural, some are created by humans on both lists. So thinking of wind and running water and thunder are incidental sounds caused by nature versus the sounds of the highway and machines and the other incidental sounds created by humans. So that could be an interesting way to parse out what you had been hearing. I asked at the end of the assignment if you felt that any single sounds or combinations of sounds were struck you as being musical. And of course, like our last lesson, you could refer back to Webster or Wiki's definitions of music or your own personal definition of music and whether those things qualified. Is a bird singing a song music, or is that separate because it's not created by humans and it's not intended to be heard as music per se? So something to reflect on, whether any of it qualified as music. And I'm especially interested again in anyone who has a definition of music that doesn't necessarily align with sort of a gut instinct of whether those things are musical. Something to think about. In a way, this assignment prepares us for the remainder of the semester as we focus on music. We're used to hearing music in the background in the car, in the gas station, etc. And of course, obviously, for this class, we're going to focus a lot more on music. So I hope that we can listen as intently as we did to nature all along the way as we discuss music. Next, I'd like to discuss the spectrum and the spectrogram. We'll be getting more into this in the coming lessons, but I wanted to introduce it today because it can help us to see visually a lot of the topics that we're discussing today. So, what is a spectrum? The spectrum of a sound is the loudness of its frequencies. So that means that if a sound has very high frequencies, we would see that in its spectrum, and that's seen in something called a spectrogram or a spectrograph. And that's what we're going to be looking at here. This is a program called Adobe Audition. It's a sound editing program, but it has a very nice spectrogram that we're going to look at. The primary thing to know about a spectrogram is what it's showing you. Up at the top here, we will see in a moment the waveform. And I'll go ahead and start recording. I'm going to record my voice, and you will see both the spectrum and the waveform. So, as you see my voice coming into this program, you can see up on the top a waveform which shows the volumes up and down and the time left to right. So you see seconds running along the top here. If you can't see them, this is marking seconds. And for this top bar, the green, you see decibels, so volumes of overall sound. On the bottom here is the spectrogram. So these are two different things, the waveform and the spectrogram. The spectrogram is showing something different. It's still showing time left to right on the x-axis, but on the y-axis, instead of total volume, it's showing us frequency. And if you can't zoom in far enough to see the frequencies over here, you'll see, I can tell you what it says, from 0 to 20,000. And that is a measurement of hertz, which is the amount of cycles per second. And that is what gives us our impression of pitch. So as I zoom in here, you can see the voice is coming in, and different words and sounds from my voice register differently here in the spectrogram. what we're seeing is high pitches up here. I will whistle for a moment and you'll see a high frequency up here. And here is a low sung note. So overall, we're seeing where the different frequencies are, and the color is just a measure of volume. So you can see loud frequencies are in yellow and quiet are in purple. So you will notice things like my sibilants, they're called. So when I do an S sound, you see a noisy, complex band of lots of frequencies. We mentioned this in the last lesson that one of the definitions of noise is a broadband sound, so all frequencies or random frequencies. Here that is again. You may be familiar with the term white noise, which is that but throughout the entire audio spectrum. So today we're not really going to study all the details of what's coming into the spectrogram, but we are going to look at some different audio clips and try to see how different sounds will appear. A little side note, that a spectrogram is something you can find, and there's an app called Spectro Pro. I do believe it costs a little bit of money, maybe $7 or something, so no pressure to buy that, but if you're interested in this sort of thing, I find it a really fascinating way to engage with my surroundings. So Spectro Pro does this live, so you can pull it up on your phone and see the spectrum around you. So if you were to do another sound walkabout with that on, you would see the different shapes of sounds coming in, and you would probably be able to start to identify sounds visually by their spectrum. So now I'm going to play, while the spectrogram is on, I'm going to play a recording of nature sounds that I found from what's called a dawn chorus in Scotland. So a dawn chorus is just all of the animals and sounds of the forest at dawn. It's one of the most active times for sounds. And here it is. So please watch the spectrogram as we listen to these dawn chorus sounds. Okay, so you can notice a lot of different things as you're watching that, and you could probably tell that certain animals were kind of easily identified by their spectral print or their spectral niche here. For example, this wavy stuff here is pretty clearly differentiated from these swooping down whistles. So one of the things this program allows me to do, Adobe Audition, is to highlight and isolate one of those sounds. Let's listen back to this sound. So we can hear that as a specific animal. Let's listen to these. More of a flittering bird than this other bird. So you could record and look back, and a lot of what we'll be discussing today does show up here visually. The reading for today, which was Bernie Krause's The Niche Hypothesis, How Animals Taught Us to Dance and Sing. So in this article, he begins with this story of being led to the banks of a creek that fed into Lake Wallowa in Oregon with a tribal elder from the Nez Perce tribe. And he talks about sitting next to this creekside and hearing this amazing sound, which sounded like a large pipe organ chord. Not knowing where the sound came from, Angus asks him if he can identify it. And without answering, he went and grabbed a piece of reed from the side and poked some holes in it and started playing it like a flute and said, "This is where we learned our music." So this organ sound was actually the result of reeds, so like pieces of dried out grass that had been frozen into the creek and then broken by the wind. So as the wind came through and broke all of these grass reeds, they were broken obviously at different sizes. And as the wind came over them again, it creates an organ-like sound. That's the way an organ works. It has pipes with holes in them, and the pipes are different lengths, like you see in a church or wherever you can see a pipe organ. The lengths of those pipes make lower or higher pitches if they're longer or shorter, respectively. So this was a kind of natural organ that he was shown, and really amazing kind of experience. Thinking about what does this tell us about, what does this teach us about music and about nature, how they work together? I would say it tells us that music is all around. Sometimes you have to go and find it or have someone show you where it is, and that nature makes its own music, and also that the Nez Perce and other cultures have learned music from nature. And so I wanted to ask all of you to think about, do you think that nature inspired the first music that was created by humans? It's not something we can know, and I imagine that different humans throughout the world created music in different ways, of course, so maybe there isn't an answer, but there certainly are some examples of music being cited as the inspiration for, or rather that nature is the inspiration for music, excuse me. We'll get to another example of that. Speaking of the Aka or Baka people from Cameroon, if music doesn't come from nature, maybe where else could it have come from? Did someone invent it? Possibly it could have also arisen from poetry. We know of the ancient Greek music that some of the first notated music that still exists today that we can find on pieces of pottery is poetry in ancient Greek, or in Hurrian, like the example that you have on your listening journal, it's poetry with other letter symbols ascribed above the poetry saying what notes to sing in a scale. So it'd be like if we wrote A, B, C, D above some poetry. And so we could say that possibly another way that music sprung up is from poetry and amplifying the drama of poetry. So coming back to this article, he mentions that composers know how to create sonic spaces. He says that right here, that composers know how to create a piece of music that makes sense in terms of the orchestration, so in terms of what instruments we hear, and that they can all be heard. He says that experienced composers know that in order to achieve an unimpeded resonance, the sound of each instrument must have its own unique voice and place in the spectrum of events being orchestrated. So, like the spectrum that we just looked at here, he's saying that composers know if you have a ton of trumpets playing really loud right here, you're probably not going to hear a harp that's playing very quietly at the same time because they're occupying the same pitch space. Let's say they're playing the same notes. One of them is much louder, so it's covering it up. And so he goes on to talk about how nature has a kind of orchestration as well, because as animals learn to survive over the thousands and thousands of years, they found acoustic niches for themselves, ways of being heard over the din. You can see here in this spectrogram, you can see the pitches over here. These are 2,000 hertz and 8,000 hertz, that there are these bands of frequencies, so these little areas of frequency or pitch that are very, very loud. It would be hard for a new animal to come around and exist with its sound existing in this band that's already taken up, or in this wide band, which is probably insects, like cicadas do this kind of thing. So animals, in order to survive, their alarm calls need to be heard, their mating calls need to be heard, and so they adapted ways of cutting through the acoustic spectrum to be heard. You notice he points out this swift, which is a bird, and look at how it makes this tall, multi-frequency kind of slapping sound. It sound a little bit like that. That cuts through the din of this, the background noise of these insects, and so it's able to be heard. And so if we look back again here at the chorus that we were listening to from Scotland, you can see these birds, you may remember these birds here doing these swooping sounds, and the motion of the sound, or you might say the melody of the sound, is important too. It helps it to be heard. And then we also see these kind of more swoopy sounds. Let's go a little bit this way. Up here, that are in a different frequency range. So they're much higher and they are able to be heard. So Krauss hypothesizes that animals evolved into acoustic niches, and that they need them to survive. And of course, he ends the article by talking about something very important, which is that many of these animals have not only been threatened in terms of their physical habitat, so the forests have in some cases been deforested and cut down, but also their acoustic habitat is important to try to protect and appreciate. If an animal is occupying this acoustic niche here, like this brown barbet around 4 kilohertz, then what if we have a new factory that's put in right next door, and it makes kind of a screeching sound all the time that exists in this acoustic niche? It's possible that could threaten the very survival of this species. So I hope you appreciated this article, and it launches us off further into the topic of nature and music. Along similar lines is a piece of music created by Chris Mercer, who is one of my teachers, called The Audible Phylogeny of Lemurs. And this is a different but related work. He went to the Duke Lemur Center. There's a big center at Duke in Durham where they have many, many, many types and species of lemurs. Lemurs are a pretty amazing animal. They're a primate. And you can see here listed there are a bunch of different species, and the way that those species are related and categorized. You can see this tree shows which ones are closer related to other ones. So he made a piece of music using recordings of these lemurs to show their variety and how we can hear in their calls that they're related. So instead of doing a big discussion on this, I'm just going to click play and click through a few portions of it so you can hear some of the amazing diversity of these lemurs, and you can look at which ones are highlighted here to see the connections that he's making between their vastly different types of calls. Okay. Well, if you want to go listen to the rest of this, please do. It's by Chris Mercer. It's called The Audible Phylogeny of Lemurs. It's pretty amazing just to appreciate all of the different types of sounds this animal makes, some of which may strike us as funny or strange, I think partly because they can be almost human-like. And so now I would like to go on and just listen to a couple more seconds of this while we look at the audio spectrum, and then we'll look at some more examples. So I just want you to be able to see some of these lemurs in the audio spectrum. I'll stop it there, but hopefully you can appreciate and see all the different ways that they can cut through the spectrum, both vertically, meaning in terms of broadband pitch, and how they can cut through horizontally, which would be more like a melody. So now we'll move on to talking about some other elements of music and nature. Last segment of today's lesson, I'd just like to share some other examples of nature music or music from nature. The first is by Lee Weisert and Jonathan Kirk. It is called Cryoacoustic Orb, and it is microphones that are frozen inside an ice block, and the ice melts as we hear the sounds that they make. So hearing that example and seeing some clips from it, it makes me think of two things. One is why would someone record inside of a frozen orb? Um, I think that it provided some sounds we don't normally get to hear because our ears can only go in so many places, and microphones actually can go underwater or in ice, and we get to hear these very high, strange sounds that we would not hear. Maybe when we're pulling ice out of the freezer, we can hear it a little bit, but it's a unique perspective for sound. And the other point, I think, is that thinking of climate change and the melting of polar ice caps that's happening during our lifetime. So, what do you think we're hearing here? Maybe you've already read a little bit about it, but this, I believe, relates to the example from the Krauss article in a way, because it's something that's in a way being played by nature, but it is not the same as the Krauss example because it is created by humans. So, after the story here of this sea organ is after the devastation of World War II, this area in Croatia, Zadar, was trying to be reconstructed because it had been devastated by the war. And during this frantic reconstruction, they turned much of the seafront into this unbroken concrete wall. And so it was a little bit kind of bleak looking. They just needed it to be functional at the edge of the city. So architect Nikola Bašić made a project to redesign the city coast, and it was finished in 2005, and it involves this sea organ, which has now become rather famous. I would love to visit it someday. It's pipes under the concrete wall there that get played by the organ by the sea. So as the waves come in, they push air through these pipes that are underneath where you walk, and so you get to hear that beautiful sound. And I think this is an interesting case because, like I was saying about the example from the Krauss, we have nature created an instrument which we might have called the creek organ, and nature was also playing the instrument with wind. In this case, we have an architect that's built an instrument. You might say he's the composer of this piece of music, but still the performer of the music is the sea, is nature. Here's another similar case that I really wanted to share because I think it's quite beautiful. It's the singing, ringing tree. And we won't stop to talk about this one because it's similar to the other cases that we mentioned, but it is an organ that is played by the wind. And here's the singing, ringing tree. the beautiful songs of the humpback whale. So the humpback whale is known for very, very long songs that it will sing. They have the ability to hear much higher and much lower than humans underwater for miles and miles and miles. Their songs are believed by scientists to begin and end and can be split over the course of a season, so they may be halfway through a particular song and stop as the season ends, and when they return to that same spot next year, pick up the song in the same place they left off. So amazing animals with very complex calls. We can think about these songs as being no humans involved, of course, but being a little bit different than the reed organ from the Nez Perce example from Krauss, because in this case, if we think back to the question from earlier about intentionality, these whales are singing on purpose. So in comparison to the wind that's blowing without any known purpose, this is nature at some of its best, creating music with no humans involved. Here's the humpback whale. I hope you enjoy. So finally, to wrap up our lesson for today, I'd like us all to listen to some music by the Aka people of Cameroon in Africa. You have a different example by a related tribe called the Baka in your listening journals. So you'll have a chance to respond to that during your listening journal. But I wanted to end today with that because it, in a way, could bring it full circle. We've just looked at how music arises in nature with and without human help, or that we could see the sounds of the dawn chorus in Scotland or the orchestra of animals in Africa as being music. And in what I've read about the Aka people's music, they have said that this music as a purpose is to respond to the forest. They hear the music of lemurs and other animals in the forest, and they make this beautiful polyphonic music as a response. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll be moving on after this to talk more about hearing and the nature of sound.